Welcome to Coda Zero Earth. My name is Kate Charlesworth. I'm in Sydney in Australia, and together with my colleague Forbes McGain in Melbourne, we will be co-hosting today's episode. Firstly, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever you are in the world today, we ask that you also take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which you stand. Today we are proud to collaborate with Teleflex, who are supporting this educational event. Teleflex are passionate advocates for advancing the cause of sustainable healthcare and corporate social responsibility in the medical device industry.
Thanks, Kate. So in a way, it's fine because we've actually covered some of the areas of action, and that's really important as well. I've seen a lot of questions coming through, which is great. Here we acknowledge that it's a pretty anxiety-provoking discussion, but that action is the antidote for that. I think we've seen already some good discussions about what we can do, but maybe I will actually reflect and go through again with the team of panelists what you might do, and I might say also what I might do, because I think personally that so some of the questions have been asking about what's more important, work or home. Well, sadly, with apologies to my better half, work does matter more than home, because we use so much. So, for example, a 300-bed hospital in Australia is about 5,000 to 10,000 houses worth of energy. It's a monster, and that's just the energy. That's direct energy. And so, as an example of some of the things we've done, like we were able to rationalise the use of our steam sterilisers. So we switched off a steam steriliser, and that actually turned off 10 houses. Each load of a steam steriliser uses about the same as an entire house per day of everything in the house, all the stuff you use for electricity, all the gas you use. So it actually really does matter. We put on 300 kilowatts of solar panels on the appropriately labelled Sunshine Hospital. These things really do matter. They make a big difference. And I've really been involved in these sorts of simple things involving teams over the last, goodness knows, 15 years now. And so I think all these things at work really, really do matter. I think the other important point is joining groups. And I'll say that, in Australia, Doctors for the Environment Australia, DEA, the Climate and Health Alliance, Climate Health Association, Global Green and Healthy Hospitals. There's a lot of groups within each country. I'm sure that Omni will be able to tell us about Egypt, and Michelle for the US, and Courtney for Canada. But I think those groups are also really important, because otherwise, often I'm feeling so anxious, I feel alone, but I feel much less alone if I'm with a team. Tim, yes, we are in a mess, but we have a chance to save ourselves. And looking in, could you maybe refresh what should we be doing? What little advice do you have for us further from what you've already discussed?
Sure, Forbes. Look, the good news is that this is a solvable problem, and solvable in relatively short order. And I think the COVID pandemic has shown us the steps that need to be taken to solve the climate problem. So the first thing you have to do in both the case of the pandemic and the climate problem is stop the problem growing. And we've done that globally in the pandemic case by social isolation and changing of rules and so forth. With climate change, it's really simple. You just got to stop burning the fossil fuels. If we can decrease our burning of fossil fuels by 10% a year, we can do it. And the thing is, solar and wind are now the cheapest form of energy over most of the planet. So it's not even as if it's going to be a costly exercise. We're taking an economically logical option to do this. So there's studies in Australia which have shown that we can transition from currently 60% coal to almost zero coal in 3 years with the appropriate investment. We can do this, we know that. We then have to create an emergency room, because there's a lot of damage which has already occurred, and there's more damage coming down the pipeline. And that emergency capacity really concerns our health system, but it also concerns our natural systems. So in Australia, what can we do to help the prospects of the Great Barrier Reef? It may cease existing at 2 degrees of warming unless we can do something. So we need to think about adaptation. We need to think about how we can invest wisely to make sure that we minimise the impacts. So give us robustness and resilience in the face of inevitable change. Thirdly, we have to start the equivalent of a search for a vaccine. It's very expensive, the outcome is uncertain, but we have to do it. And in the climate terms, the search for a vaccine is a search for means of drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it, because there's already too much there. So we can do that by protecting our forests, by regrowing our forests, letting nature heal in a way that draws CO2 out of the air and puts it into plants and into soils and so forth. We can use the ocean similarly with seaweed to do the same sort of thing. So giving the planet a chance to heal is really the vaccine. So we know those steps, we know we can do them. What we lack at the moment is willpower. We lack a united will to do it. If we had that united will, I can guarantee you that this problem would start abating very quickly.
Thank you very much, Tim. Omnia, could you perhaps even give us one success in Egypt and what your advice might be?
Yes, sure. So in Egypt, I think it's good, and it's also, good news for us that all the action that I'm seeing in Egypt in terms of climate change are all youth-led. Yeah, this year I had the opportunity to speak in the first ever youth-led climate change conference. It was in January, and it was the first time for it to be held in Egypt among youth to discuss the impacts of climate change, both not just the health, but also the socio-economic, because it had not just health students, but students from all the different kinds of universities. And this really inspired me, especially when I'm working in pharmacy. We've been really advocating for integrating climate change in the medical curriculum. And because of the survey that I mentioned at the beginning, and we discovered this gap that only 15% mention climate change in 118 countries. And this inspired us to develop a curriculum for medical schools to integrate. And I was also talking with my public health professor about the possibility of that, and they were actually very open to it. So this is a dream of mine, and I hope it would be a future success story that in my university they will be teaching climate change, even if it's just a small lecture, but it is a dream that I hope I and all medical students around the world can see happening.
Thank you. Michelle.
It's a great story. So I think it's really important to celebrate our successes when we have them. We have a rather large portfolio and we are early on our CSR journey, but one success that I wanted to share that we're really proud of is in our interventional urology business, which we are striving to be a leader in BPH care. We invested in a holistically considered design enhancements to improve our environmental footprint. We were able to reduce the amount of device and associated packaging that is disposed of following the procedure. The actual volume of packaged materials consumed in the average case, we were able to decrease by 48%. There was a reduction in the PETG vacuum form plastic and paperboard used in the packaging of 38% and 23% respectively. This also led to some additional positive environmental impact by lessening the transportation to customers, reducing our carbon footprint. It's one step, but we'll keep taking steps, and that is our commitment. So that's one success I wanted to share.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And Courtney.
Thanks. Yeah, something we're really proud of here in Canada is the role of health professionals in the Canadian coal power phase out efforts. So in Ontario, about 15 years ago now, essentially health professionals joined forces with community groups to really make clear the number of kids that were going to hospitals every year with asthma exacerbations as a result of the air pollution from coal plants. That effort resulted in a commitment to phase out coal in Ontario that was accomplished. I think it was in about 2014. And so that was the largest decrease in greenhouse gas emissions from any single policy anywhere in North America. That was leveraged with similar people to a commitment to phase out coal in Alberta, which is our most conservative province. We have stereotypes about people. Nobody wants their kids in the emergency department with asthma. And so that was, again, health professional messengers. And then later for a national commitment to coal phase out. And because health professionals in the UK were doing similar things, that allowed Canada and the UK to co-found the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is now a group of countries every year more sign on that say, hey, we too want to phase out coal to protect health. And so those are really, it's an illustration of the power of health messengers and calling to the best in people, which is what we can do when we say, hey, let's protect our kids.
Thank you very much. Kate, do you want to ask some questions and then I could wrap up a bit after that?
Yeah, sure. So there's just a couple of questions, Tim, about sort of drawdown. You've talked about sort of natural-based solutions. Is there anything else on the table, or is that the way we should be going? Could you talk a bit more about that?
Look, there are a number of options. All of them have difficulties and all are at a fairly early stage. The natural-based solutions have the benefit that the power source is free. It's the sun and photosynthesis, you know, and we can do it at some sort of scale. There are industrial processes as well that are quite promising, and some of them are good not just for drawdown and sequestration of carbon, but for substituting for fossil fuels. So as a company in British Columbia, for example, it makes an e-fuel out of carbon dioxide from the air, which you can use as a jet fuel in aircraft. So it's kind of that sort of stuff is really good. We can also use silicate rocks, which are a kind of rock that's quite common in the Earth's crust. As silicate rocks decompose, they capture CO2 from the atmosphere, and studies have shown that if we just use the off-cut rocks and ground up bits of rock from existing industries, we could be capturing 2 gigatons of CO2 a year using that and fertilising our fields, our farmlands. So there are a number of options. It's one of those issues where we're at very early stage. We need to get moving on it, and we need to create a market for those solutions, really, which is a carbon price.
And then I guess a lot of the other questions are about sort of the levers that we have. You talked a lot about it's really, you know, we have the technology, we know what we need to do. It's just a matter of will and political will in some cases. What are the levers that we have? A few questions have been about client Earth, using legal sort of levers, economics, so divestment, and I might actually ask Courtney about that as well. You know, can we, you know, use our influence in terms of our, you know, financial power? And then are there independent science-based groups that we can support to combat the concentrated media power that has been talked about today? So what levers should we be using?
Look, all of those are really important, but another important lever is to target those people in government who are in the pocket of the fossil fuel lobby and oppose them. You know, last year I was part of a movement in electorate where we got rid of one of the worst climate skeptics in the Australian Federal Parliament and replaced her with a young woman who is very, very pro-action on climate change and widely supported by the community. She got 58% of the vote. And it just shows you these things are possible and the willingness is there in the community, but we have to get politically motivated and behind people who are willing to stand up and stand for election.
Okay, great. Courtney, what do you think are the most important levers that we should be using? Any of those that I've mentioned and others? Or others?
I think of this in terms of shifting our vision, shifting our money, and shifting power. A lot of the time we've been sold this thing, you know, this is about your consumer choices. This is about where money and power go. And so when we think about money, that's divestment. We know that the vast majority of fossil fuel reserves can't be dug up. And the world's fossil fuel companies, their stock market price varies with their reserves. So I divested from fossil fuels when my daughter was, 6 months old. I haven't lived to regret that because fossil fuel free funds are actually outperforming the ones that contain fossil fuels. And all of the predictions we're seeing going forward, whether it's from the International Energy Agency or other, say that that's going to still be a good move. So whether that's at the individual level, at the community level, at the organizational level, national health systems level, or medical associations, that's super important. And as Tim was saying, we need to shift influence. So how can we provide evidence-based influence? I keep coming back to this thing where 5 times as many meetings were held with fossil fuel lobbyists in Canada over about a 7-year period between federal decision makers as were held with NGOs. We can overwhelm that. We don't have the deep pockets of the fossil fuel industry, but we've got numbers and we also have the truth and people's good intentions on our side. So ensuring evidence-based influence is key.
Thanks. Michelle or Omnia, is there anything that you would like to talk about in terms of levers and influence? Sorry, that was Michelle.
Sorry, just following on that same theme around evidence-based influence, there's opportunities again to receive support for research support through corporate social responsibility. That is a domain in which industry contributes. So I'm not sure if all, researchers out there are aware of that, but certainly there are resources that you can tap into to support this work, and it would also benefit the industry because it would allow them to show their support in this domain, and there's things such as ESG scores in which they're rated on this type of contribution. So just wanted to offer that as a resource.
Thanks. And Omni, I know that divestment has been quite a strong theme among a lot of students around the country. Is that something that you've been involved in, or what would be your thoughts there?
So for me in Egypt specifically, as I said, it wasn't really easy for us to introduce the idea of divestment because, again, we had a huge transition in terms of our economy, and it's difficult to talk about this kind of movement at this specific time in Egypt, and I know in many other countries within the Middle East region. But I've seen many medical students in IFMSA do that, especially in Canada and Australia, and they, in spite of the challenges that they face, I've also seen this kind of movement, and I really, for the first time, learned about it when I went with IFMSA to my first climate change conference in Poland, where I met youth from all over the world, and they were talking about divestment and coal phase out, and really asking the key decision makers that they're seeing in the UN climate change conference with the demonstrations and actions. And I actually did an action with Courtney and a group of the health community where we had banners inside the conference itself saying that the climate crisis is a health crisis, and each one of us held a health impact due to climate change, for example, heat stress or air pollution or cancer. And we did that right next to a side event that was hosted by a country talking about the idea of this natural gas. And we were really trying to highlight how this is not the solution and this is a health crisis. So this is how I was involved in that on a global level, and I would really love to bring this to my country in Egypt. But for me, when I feel that there's more mobilization of youth in that. And one small thing wanted to add in terms of research and evidence-based, I really want to highlight the importance of involving youth in that kind of evidence and research, because we do a lot of activism, and with the right mentorship and the right guidance, we can really work collectively and co-create evidence in order to push for policies to be implemented.
Forbes, I'll hand back to you. I know that you're going to be wrapping up shortly, but the remaining questions are about what gives us hope. What gives the panelists hope that we can get there?
Yeah, what gives us hope, I suppose, hope springs eternal. It keeps me going because you can all get rather depressed and anxious otherwise. But it was ever thus. So I think I've really enjoyed this. It's been fantastic. And I do want to say that it's been a really interesting series of conversations. I will point out that there are some really big topics here, and I think has come up in the questions, that there are whole topics in themselves, like population. I mean, that's a really important area to be discussing, the world population. If there were 25 billion on the planet, well, we wouldn't be here. So I think those sorts of questions actually, as a call out to Roger Harris and the team from CODA to say this could be a whole other discussion down the track. And I think that that's really important because we shouldn't forget that's part of the story. I think there are other points from the CODA expert team, including the panelists here and others, was how do we, what are some things we could be doing? I do think that in terms of energy, I think that we moving as quickly as some other sectors is really important. For example, the university sector in Australia is charging ahead, absolutely charging ahead of healthcare. And they're going to be carbon neutral well before we are. And that just seems quite ironic. So I think electrifying everything that we can, a good example, and I know this is local, but in Canberra, there's a new hospital going to be built that's going to be purely electric, no gas. So I think getting off gas as quickly as possible is really, really important. 100% renewable electricity, getting off gas. That's a big one that involves not just one person doing that, obviously. That's at the level of involving yourself with teams. I've mentioned some of the groups in the past. Find someone in your own country who's involved in this and working together to do that. I think there's also a lot of more local things that can be done. And I know that Courtney's already mentioned micro, meso, and macro, as well as perhaps meta efforts. And I will say that these things are going to be followed up for the group that are listening in and others. There'll be ongoing discussion. We'll be adding to the story as we go along in future. I think a rapid reduction in what we call the super pollutants is important, and this includes certain anesthetic gases like desflurane and nitrous oxide. Having, knowing that that's tricky because at least in Australia, in some parts, many births are happening with mothers using nitrous oxide. But these are all things that can be worked on. Fluorocarbons for inhalers, as Kate and I were discussing, really, really important for GPs to be thinking about getting off the highly polluting greenhouse gases that are used as propellants for the standard asthma pump sort of things, getting onto dry ones. I think that nature-based solutions are really, really important. And these things, us as GPs and other doctors and nurses working, with patients to think of what are some environments that might make you less stressed. I know that Michelle mentioned dealing with stress with yoga and other sorts of mental health, benefiting ways is really, really important. I think that plant-based diets, introducing, imagine into our hospital that we just have, no meat Friday, for example. Those sorts of things could be really, really easy to do. And they're not that hard to do, but they actually are not happening necessarily at the moment. I think those sorts of things are going to be discussed. There's going to be lots of opportunity for the participants today and everyone listening in to think about how we can add to these micro, meso and macro sorts of goals that will come along in future.
There is something I'd like to mention, if it's okay, because I think it's really exciting. Just a couple of weeks ago in the Lancet, an international intergenerational team published a new Hippocratic oath for the Anthropocene. And so when I think about what gives me hope, I'm thinking about this entire globe reframing their vision of health to planetary health. So I'll ask people to take a look at it, but the first line is, I solemnly pledge to dedicate my life to the service of humanity and to the protection of natural systems on which human health depends. And so I think so much of reducing the courage barrier depends on solidarity and depends on really the opportunity to say in front of our community, hey, this is what we're going to focus on. And so I'm so excited for all of the different times we're going to be able to say those words together in different fora around the world. I think this is the start of a new era in medicine and health.
That's all from me. And just to acknowledge Teleflex as a supporter today for supporting this educational event. Thanks, Forbes.